The moment Jonah Mercer realized his hands were shaking, he knew this date mattered more than he'd admitted to himself. Sunlight streamed through the wide cafe windows, dust motes floating like tiny witnesses to a life he'd carefully kept guarded for years. This wasn't just a coffee date. This was the first time since loss had rearranged his entire world that he'd allowed himself to sit across from someone new and imagine, just for a moment, that life might still hold something gentle for him. And then, just when hope felt safe enough to breathe in, everything shifted in a single sentence that cracked open wounds he thought had scarred over. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and quiet miracles that happen in ordinary daylight, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel Home with Dad. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Jonah had not planned for this day to feel so heavy. He'd woken before dawn, as he always did, the habit carved into him by years of parenthood and responsibility. Morning light had filled the small kitchen of his townhouse as he packed his daughter's lunch, the smell of toasted bread and apples reminding him that his life revolved around small, necessary rituals. At 38, Jonah was a single father to 9-year-old Caleb, a boy with thoughtful eyes and a laugh that arrived unexpectedly, like sunlight after rain. Jonah loved his son with a devotion that bordered on fear, because loving something that much meant you could never stop worrying about losing it. The loss had already happened once. For years earlier, cancer had taken his wife in a way that felt both brutally sudden and endlessly drawn out. Since then, Jonah had learned how to function in the daylight, how to smile at school pickup, how to answer polite questions from coworkers without letting grief spill out in inconvenient places. Nights were harder, but daytime demanded performance, and Jonah had become very good at performing stability. It was during one of those daytime performances that he'd met Mara Collins. She worked at the local community arts center, where Jonah volunteered on weekends to keep himself busy. She was warm without being intrusive, kind without being pitying. They talked about books, about the quiet courage it took to show up for children every day, about how life rarely turned out the way anyone planned. Their conversations felt easy, like slipping into a well-worn sweater. When she suggested coffee one afternoon, Jonah surprised himself by saying yes. Now, sitting across from her in the cafe, Jonah felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Not grief, not fear exactly, something closer to hope, which was far more dangerous. The cafe buzzed with midday life, laptops clicking, cups clinking, sunlight warming the wooden tables. Outside, people passed by with grocery bags and strollers, living their ordinary lives. Jonah wondered when his own life had stopped feeling ordinary and started feeling like something fragile he had to protect. He noticed the way Mara listened, really listened, leaning forward slightly as he talked about Caleb's obsession with astronomy and the way he insisted on pointing out constellations even in broad daylight. Jonah hadn't talked about his son this openly with anyone new before, but with Mara it felt natural. Safe, as if the story of his life didn't need editing. For the first time in years, Jonah allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't just survival. He imagined weekend mornings with laughter that wasn't tinged with sadness. Imagined someone sitting beside him at school events, someone who didn't see him as broken or brave, but simply human. The thought made his chest ache in a way that felt almost sweet. Then the moment came. Not loud, not dramatic in the way movies promise. Just a shift in the air, a tightening around Mara's eyes as she set her coffee down. The words landed softly but carried the weight of entire histories colliding. She told him he could leave, that she understood if this was too much, because she was a single mother. The cafe didn't change. The sunlight didn't dim. But Jonah felt as if the ground beneath him had tilted. In that instant, years of carefully stacked emotions threatened to topple. Jonah wasn't afraid of single mothers. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. He was afraid of the mirror she held up to his own life, of the reminder that two people carrying loss could either help each other heal or reopen wounds that never fully closed. He was afraid of what it meant to choose something new when his entire identity had been forged in grief and fatherhood. Jonah's first instinct was to retreat. He'd spent years mastering retreat. Pull back, regroup, protect the fragile balance he and Caleb had built. The idea of blending lives, of introducing someone new into his son's world, felt overwhelming. The idea of failing again felt unbearable. Mara watched him quietly, not with accusation, but with understanding that cut deeper than judgment ever could. Jonah realized she wasn't testing him. She was giving him an exit because she'd learned, as he had, that people often leave when things get complicated. Jonah didn't leave. Instead, he sat there, breathing through the noise in his head, realizing that the fear he felt wasn't a warning. It was a sign that something mattered. He thought of Caleb at school, probably staring out the window, imagining stars invisible in the midday sky. He thought of how often he'd told his son that being brave didn't mean not being scared. It meant doing the right thing anyway. That afternoon marked the beginning of a slow, careful unfolding. Jonah and Mara didn't rush. They talked about boundaries, about children, about the mistakes they'd made and the lessons they carried. Mara's daughter, Eliza, was 7, thoughtful and observant, with a quiet resilience that reminded Jonah painfully of his own child. Both adults understood that their children came first, that any step forward had to be taken with intention. Daytime became the setting for their tentative connection. Walks in the park under open skies, conversations over lunch while the world moved around them, moments that felt grounded and real. Jonah noticed how Mara never tried to replace anyone in his life. She honored the past without being threatened by it. In return, Jonah learned to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. The real challenge came not from Mara, but from Jonah himself. He struggled with guilt, with the feeling that moving forward meant leaving something behind. He struggled with the fear that happiness was temporary, that letting his guard down would invite loss back into his life. On days when Caleb laughed easily, Jonah felt hopeful. On days when his son grew quiet and withdrawn, Jonah questioned everything. Mara faced her own battles. She worried about how Eliza would react, about whether she had the strength to trust again. She carried her own scars, invisible but heavy. Together, they learned that love after loss wasn't about erasing pain. It was about making room for joy alongside it. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that never makes it into highlight reels. Jonah watched Mara and Eliza at the park, sunlight catching in Eliza's hair as she chased pigeons across the grass. Caleb stood nearby, hesitant but curious. Jonah felt his chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with recognition. This was what healing looked like. Not dramatic declarations, not perfect moments, but small, shared experiences under a bright sky. Caleb eventually joined Eliza, their laughter echoing across the park. Jonah realized then that children were far braver than adults gave them credit for. They understood loss, but they also understood connection. They knew when something felt safe. Jonah's struggles didn't disappear overnight. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, moments when old habits resurfaced. But each time, Jonah chose to stay. He chose to talk instead of retreat, to trust instead of assume the worst. He learned that love wasn't a risk to be avoided. It was a responsibility to be honored. As weeks turned into months, Jonah felt something shift inside him. The constant tension he'd carried began to ease. He found himself smiling more, sleeping better, laughing without immediately bracing for the pain that usually followed. Mara didn't fix him. She didn't need to. She simply walked beside him as he learned to fix himself. The story didn't end with perfection. It ended with possibility. With two families learning how to coexist, how to respect each other's histories while building something new. It ended with Jonah realizing that the sentence that had almost sent him running had actually been an invitation to empathy, to understanding, to a deeper kind of love. Near the end of one sunlit afternoon, as Jonah watched the children play and felt Mara's presence beside him, he understood that the bravest thing he'd ever done wasn't surviving loss. It was choosing to live again in the daylight, where hope could see him clearly. If this story has touched your heart, if it reminded you that healing is possible even after profound loss, please take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who might need encouragement, and let us know in the comments how it made you feel. Your engagement helps keep stories like this alive and reaching those who need them most. And just before we end, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below with one word that captures what this story meant to you. Jonah Mercer didn't find a perfect ending. He found something better, a beginning rooted in honesty, patience, and the courage to stay when leaving would have been easier. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.